Let and const, yet another great addition to ES6. And for me to explain it, I want to go back to var. Now, as you know, var is used to define variables, right? Now, let and const were added for a certain purpose. Now, let's go through what the difference is. Var is used within global, within function scope, and within also something called a local scope. However, let and const were made for using block scoping. Now, what does that mean, you might be asking, okay? Block scoping, it really is simply a scope between brackets. Now, if you're asking what that means, then I'm going to show you what that means. I created this graph to kind of give you an understanding of what I mean by scope, function scope, global scope, and so forth. And if you look at the right-hand side right here, and let me go ahead, I'm going to use my pointer, my fancy pointer. Look at that. Oh, that's a cool pointer. If I use my global, you can see that the global scope is a scope that's the whole application scope. And within that scope, that's where you can, use the variables that are defined in the global scope. So if you define a certain variable in the global scope, you can use it anywhere inside the application, right? Then there's the function scope. The function scope is a scope within an individual function, in this case, let var example. And so what this scope defines, okay, this says, okay, think of it as, you have a city, which is a global scope. Just think about that. The city is the global scope. Within the city, you have a house, okay? And a house is the function scope. And inside this house, right, you can, obviously inside this house, you have people living inside this house. You have certain type of things that you can do, right? Obviously, you live in the house, you sleep, you eat and so forth. The same thing within this function. The function scope, you define variables, you define functions, and you can use it within this specific function. That's called a function scope. Block scope is simply, think of it as also a function scope, but block scope is defined within the brackets, within certain brackets. That really all it is. You can see we have two examples here. We have var, first name, and then we have let, last name. And what happens in this specific function is, if true, then we define first name using var, and then we define last name using let. And then below this, we console log first name and we console log last name, right? What do you think is the difference between this? What do you think is going to happen when we console log these? Well, remember I told you var can be used within the function scope. So when you define var first name, really what happens is it's defined the function scope, and you can still see inside the function scope because we're accessing it inside the function scope. However, last name is defined within the block scope. It's defined within this specific block right here. So what that means is we can't really access it anywhere outside of this block. That means if we console log this, we're gonna get a certain error. Now, let's see what I'm talking about. I have an example here. Now, these examples will be linked down below. You can simply go ahead and download it in the description below, and it will be a link to the code, and you can just download it and use it for yourself as well and follow along with me. You can see I have this function right here called let var example, just as you saw here. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to open this up. So copy path, just how we did it before. And I'm going to paste this in. Now I see this, obviously this returns nothing. But the most important thing for us is the console, right? And you can see right away the answer. You can see right away first name, which was using var. You can see that we can access it, and it's displaying Nazari, which is the first name. However, last name, which was using let, which exists only inside this block right here, inside this block, when we try to use it outside of this block, it says, no, last name is not defined because we can't see it. And so that is why the difference between those var, let, and const. Now, const, again, const acts just the same as let. However, what const does, and let me give you an example. So let's say we define const, another example equals test, right? And let's say now we do console log, another example. Now, obviously, if that happens, we refresh it, well, we need to remove this in order for it to not, let me remove this in order for it to go through test, right? So now let's try and redefine it. So another example equals, let's do test 2. What do you think will happen now? Now, let and const, the main difference between them is the fact that with let, or even var, let and var, the value can change. So you can redefine the value when you initially set it. However, const, once you set the value, you cannot really change the value. That's it. It's a constant. Think of it as it's a constant. So if we try, go ahead and we change it, another example to something else, what do you think we get? You see it says right here, assignment to constant variable, uncaught type error. We cannot reassign another example to another string because it's a constant. If we use let in this case, right? Completely fine. No problem. Test 2, it uses the latest one. But if you use const, that's when it's a problem. Now, there are certain use cases which, in this case, for example, let's say it's an array. Let's say it's 1, 2, 3. Oh, 3. No, 4. No, 3. And let's say we want to push to this array, and we want to push 4, another, number 4 to this array. If we go ahead, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think it's going to error out, or do you think it's going to be fine? Well, let's try it. You can see all is good. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. The reason why is because the value didn't really change, right? This is another example. It's really an array. Think of it as it's an array that's stored in a certain location in the computer, right? And there's an address to this location, and the address didn't really change. All that simply happened was that address simply expanded. All that happened was that the location for it expanded, and so that's why it didn't really error out. And so that's why const is really constant when you change the value, but when you're, for example, using arrays, it's completely fine. And so that, my friends, is let, const, and var. And most of the times at this point, we're going to be using let because it is more defined in scope. And for example, when I work on professional projects with React and I'm building large applications, you want to make sure that you have some kind of restrictions in the scope. And so that's why we use let, pretty much let and const all the time at this point. So moving forward, we're going to be using these let and const declarations instead of var. So just keep that in mind, okay?